you proposed a kind of the title, right? And I wrote it down, and you said, and I might have gotten it wrong because those were a phone call, but you said what we hear versus what we can measure.
I guess, yeah.
You wanted to talk about that, and I said, isn't that like psychoacoustics versus acoustics? And you said, well, that doesn't sound as fun, so.
Yeah, if that was the title. But now that we're there, it's psychoacoustics versus acoustics. And then acoustics versus what we hear versus what microphones hear versus what analyzers hear, and it gets all pretty confusing. What got this started, Joe, I think was this little message that you sent out that said, hey, I'm working on an application in which you'd be able to put in information about your speaker and its directivity and all this stuff, and it's going to help you figure out what a target curve is. And I'm like, I want that. Please tell me more about that. And then was like, well, let's get on a podcast. So if what I just said started to sound like I'm speaking a different language, that's because it gets a little complicated. So here's the deal. There's all kinds of fields in science where you can measure with instruments, a micrometer. You can get into very, very sophisticated astronomy with all these different tools we have. And in our business, we have these analyzers. We have these tools that allow to put a special microphone in a room, an actual test microphone that, it looks totally different than this. They're usually omnidirectional. It doesn't really matter. They're just a good microphone. And you plug them into an analyzer, which Room EQ Wizard is a great version of. And you measure what's going on in the room. And you're looking at stuff on a screen, and it tells you one thing, but what it actually sounds like is often different.
I was hoping Aaron would have one just like arm's reach.
What, a microphone?
Like out of these three people, I'm like,
I have one right over there.
Here's a U mic.
There you go.
Yep. There you go.
Wrapped up.
So what's in Aaron's hand is an incredibly good, especially for the price, USB test microphone.
Yes.
So that's a great thing. Move out of focus. So what's interesting is what's inside there is the typical 1/4-inch or smaller Panasonic capsule that everybody uses on those kinds of mics. Yeah. But what makes that thing work is that it comes with a calibration file that compensates for whatever is going on with the mic, and then you got a really good measurement. The only limitation of those kinds of mics is that they're not very low noise. So if you want to measure low background noise, you can't. Who cares? Nobody's like, that's not our first intention. Our first intention is to figure out what's going on in this room. So let's just say that you blindly followed the responses that you measure from an analyzer feeding a speaker into your room, and you get your microphone and you do everything you need to do to flatten out the response. And I see you have some stuff on the screen, so you just let me know if you want to put something up, and I got to figure out what I'm going to put up. So this
I see you're back here while you're talking. You're also doing some stuff. I think you're doing a remote calibration.
Yeah, actually, right now I'm calibrating something in Mongolia. So if you hear me interrupt, no, I'm just kidding.
You speak Mongolese.
I speak Mongolese. No, I've actually been to Mongolia working on a project. Interestingly enough, that's the furthest I've been to go do stuff.
Look at this guy.
But give me a second here. Current projects. I wanted to pull this thing up.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever. Let's just put this on screen.
Okay. You let me know. You ready?
I'm ready.
Here we go.
All right. So this is a frequency response that you'll measure off some speaker in some room. And what the electronics are doing, I'll explain frequency response because some people look at this and they go, I don't know, this looks like a little lumpy stuff. This is a measurement in which you put the same level of signal starting at 20 hertz and going all the way up to 20 kilohertz, which is supposed to be the range of what we hear. Older guys don't hear all the way up there. I'm one of those. Somewhere around 13 or 14 kilohertz. I'm like, I don't hear anything anymore because I'm old. But you put a signal into the system and you change its frequency from low frequency to high frequency with the same voltage, and what should come back is exactly the same level. So if you're measuring this at the output of an amplifier or your surround decoder, it'll be, instead of being this lumpy up and down mess, actually, can you guys confirm that you can see this line moving?
Yeah.
Yep. So what you'll get back from decent electronics is a perfectly flat line. And then you put it into a speaker that's very well designed, and they don't have to cost a lot of money. And what you'll see is something that comes back that's more or less a flat line. It goes up and down 2 or 3 dB, but it's okay. That's what it's going to be like in the measurement anechoic room where there's no room. Then you put it in a room and you get this mess. This is what a room does to a speaker. Now, this one actually is equalized. Let me see if I can actually pull one that's not equalized. L, no EQ, L, near. L, no EQ. There we go. So let me get rid of that. This is the unequalized response of a speaker in a room. It's up and down. It's all over the place. This is what a room will do to a perfectly good speaker. I won't mention who the client is. I won't mention the speaker. It doesn't really matter. A room is going to change the sound of a speaker. I don't care how expensive your speaker is. It's going to change it. There are some speakers that are a little less sensitive to the room than others. A little bit less. There's ways you can design a speaker so it's a little less affected by it above 500 hertz, but a room's going to change it. Basically, as much as these hands change my voice. You understand? You all hear how that changes it, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then you measure the speaker and you go, okay, well, I can see this. What I'm trying to get to is a nice, smooth, flat line. And then what? How do you change that? Do you go into the speaker and change it? No, you don't. So how do you change it? This is a quiz. What do you do to change that?
Who are you asking?
You guys. What do you do to change the response of the speaker that's all messed up?
EQ or room treatments. One of the two. That's all you've got, right?
3 things actually.
Okay.
Or four things. If it's
All right.
if it's really bad, it's a bad speaker. Get rid of it.
Toss it.
There are,
Okay.
there are some really ugly ones out there, and I'll show you that in a minute. Let me see if I can put something up that shows a really crappy speaker. Give me a
I
second.
can probably find some of those too.
Yeah.
I think I might have a couple.
Yeah, I've owned plenty of those.
I think I've got some in the living room right now.
That went
I'm
to
at the
wrong-
Audi dealership. I'm pretty sure these in ceilings are not that great.
No, you're at an Audi dealership right now?
I need to get Wi-Fi because
Okay.
the phone was inside. My wife is going to go, and her friend are going to go do something.
So you just walked in and said, "Hey, I need to use your Wi-Fi. I've got an international podcast to do." And it's like, "Yeah, come on in."
Yeah, well, I mean, I spent $2,700 here like about an hour ago, so I think they'll be fine with it.
You paid your dues. Good.
Yeah.
I think so.
So this is some random speaker measured by some random person, not so random. There's a company that happens to have a Clipple and they measure stuff, right? And this is the frequency response of the speaker. Okay, this is not.
I don't see it on the screen yet. Do you have it up? Are you sharing it?
I do not. I do not. You are completely correct. Share screen. Press this button. Press that button. Go to this window. Go here. And I'm going to share the entire screen. We're getting there. And now you are seeing it. Boom.
All right.
Here
we go.
So can you see this? So this is a speaker.
Whole
I won't mention any names. This is a speaker. This is not a good design. And can you actually make
guesses, Aaron?
Doesn't matter. I'm taking it off.
I'm just kidding.
I don't know. I mean, the
RP600M
actually looks pretty good though. The early reflections look pretty good.
So what's interesting with that speaker is you could, if you're lucky, you could tune it. But if you didn't tune it, it's just going to sound bad for lots of different reasons.
100%. Okay.
So you have a speaker. If it's a bad design, if it's got problems, send it back. Forget about it. And how do you know if it's good or bad? Well, you can go to certain websites where people measure them. I am working with an international technical committee to actually encourage manufacturers to disclose the data on their product in a standardized way. It's called Performance Facts. It's a joint effort of CDS, CTA, and a few different organizations. And what would happen is, without any judgment, like, here's a form, they're always the same. Here's all this data. You need to learn how to read this data. But it basically shows a spinorama. If you guys ever talk about that, it shows all the right data. All right. So you got number one.
No, other way.
I can't point.
Okay.
That guy
Aaron,
is all about the.
He's all about the spinorama.
He's here for me. He's about the spinorama. He's
He's spinning right now as we speak. That's a great idea though, because I see a lot of speakers that are semi-popular, and they have no specs.
Right.
Like no specs. Like, how about some specs?
Well,
So
even
check
for
it out.
Anthony as a
Here's
custom
here's
installer.
one of the most important foods in the world: chocolate.
Uh-oh.
Specs,
You're reading my language or talking my language.
nutrition
Chocolate?
facts. Right.
Is this how we get the chocolatey bottom?
That's right. The nice rich and this is 90. What is this? Oh, this is merely 85% cacao. So there's specs on a chocolate box. Why would they not be consistent specs across the board on amplifier speakers and projectors and stuff like that? So I'm pushing that. In the next year, you'll start to see that. But
I think because a lot of them suck.
nope,
No?
that's not a good reason. I see some very good speakers with no specs out there. Sometimes I see the same version on the commercial market that have all the specs you would ever want to know to find out if this is good or bad for you.
I don't know. I think I see a lot from JBL, Harman Group, and
Well, they've kind of
Kef is not shy about that.
Kef
Right?
isn't, but JBL has kind of pulled back from publishing their stuff. Like you have to ask for it, and then sometimes you may not get it.
You look at specs on JBL, either semi-pro consumer products from 30 years ago, everything you would ever want and more. It's all in there. And then marketing went, well, people don't know what the hell this means. So they don't put it, they don't take up the room. And well, that's true. Most people don't. But for the few people who care, the people who are on this podcast, we keep calling it a podcast. I don't know what to call this video cast, this cast.
It's good enough.
Something. Hangout.
It becomes a podcast at one point, actually. So technically you're not wrong.
You all care, and just know that there's going to be a place where you can find this out. Anyway, so number one, if it's a bad speaker, send it back. Number two, if it's in the wrong place in the room, you can move it around while measuring it on your analyzer, not just by listening, going, I think it got better, I don't really know. But actually, what I like to do is I like to put, if I'm listening to one speaker, I put it on a dolly and, have a friend come over and move it around. And then as I'm listening and measuring, I look at the effects of moving it around. If it's a pair of speakers and you're listening to the image change as you go this or you go that or you go that, it's phenomenal. It is insane. Take a pair of speakers, tower speakers, it doesn't really understands, whatever, put them on two little dollies, little thing that you buy for $7 with four wheels.
Yep.
And you just have two people move them together. Or you build a little robotic thing with like controls and they move and
build a robot. Let's
build a robot.
Or Aaron, just come to my house.
I had asked Grant Imahara to build one of these for me. Do you guys know who Grant Imahara is?
No.
So he was the geeky.
I feel like I should though.
You should. You will. When I tell you, you'll go, I know that guy. He was the geeky professor. And he would show up once in a while, and I'm trying to remember his whole route. But basically on the, let's see, is anybody following up? So in Mythbusters, somebody.
Mythbusters.
So Mythbusters, there was the main people, and then once in a while something would get complex, and they would ask the professor, I'm Grant Imahara. He was my first engineer at THX. He was the first person I hired to help me do product testing and some product design interface right out of college. And then he went to ILM to build robots and special effects stuff at ILM, which was his dream job. And then he joined Mythbusters. And I was always like, Grant, you got to build me a thing that I can like move speakers around. It's like, I'll do it for you. I'll do it for you. He never got around to it. He unfortunately passed away a few years ago. And that's the end of that. Now back to our program. And I'm getting emotional because I miss him sorely. So a pair of dollies, move the speakers around and observe on an analyzer with a microphone like the one that Aaron has, and with your ears, just listening to how the sound changes. It's insane. It's insane. And I'll show you a diagram why in a second, because the interactions between the speaker and the room are changing. Every few inches you move it, you're changing how it's pinging around the room and what you hear of it tremendously.
So Anthony, are you saying there's room for both subjective listening and measurements? Like they're not completely different things? Is that what
Does that sound like a leading? Does that sound like a leading question to you guys?
Is that what's happening here?
That's a loaded question.
I don't know.
Yeah. And there is room.
What a thought.
I'll tell you why now, and I'm going to keep repeating. I am a scientist. I'm an electrical engineer, and I've also observed that the way it's funny, we were talking about mics and like I've got two like right here in front of my desk. They're here because they're either in-op, not working right, or either broken or not working right. This is a TEF really high quality microphone, and this is one made by Audix that has an XLR output. You can buy a Behringer equivalent for $60. There's no excuse to not have one of these. Anyway, so it's just like the UMM6, but it's this one is passive. The UMM6 is a USB. I forget the model number.
Oh, I said EMM6.
EMM6.
Yes.
So
that's the XLR one.
This does not listen like that. It does not. Ultimately, this and the analyzer it's connected to does not listen the same way that sound waves that go into your ear canal here and there and go into your brain and are perceived. It's getting better. It's getting closer. There's all kinds of little tricks. I have a patent on a way to get closer. It's never the same. And that's why you need to listen. Okay. Now, try to do it without this. You'll never get there. It's kind of what I like to say. It's kind of like trying to get to the baseball park and sit right behind home plate. If you don't have a map to get to the baseball park and you're in a new city, you're just going to drive around. You're going to miss the game. Right. So the GPS, as they were, or the phone, is telling you how to get to the ballpark. And then you got to get your ticket and you got to walk up and look at how you get to the best view.
I was actually going to challenge you earlier when you said, what we hear versus what we can measure. And I was going to say, can you use flying as an analogy to, looking at your gauges, something like that? Is there something there?
So I fly by looking at 3 GPSs, two iPads and one real GPS, and to not get lost. And what you see on there sometimes you don't see on the ground. It's insane. And if there's any pilots listening, you'll know what I mean. It's like you can be 2 miles from the airport and you're like, there's an airport over there. I can't see it. It's either slightly foggy, there's a little haze, there's a lot of city around it, and you're like, I'm glad I've got these instruments so I can actually, go land this thing. And then there's one thing that the instruments don't feel, which is the seat of the pants. Like when you're actually going around and you're trying to keep the right coordination, there's things you feel in your body very, very quickly because of how your ear canals work. Now back to audio. Thank you. So I'm going to do this iteratively to do very good analysis and measurement, and ultimately the point of getting to good sound. You got to have these so you can get within the ballpark, and you got to bring these along too, which I had mine permanently attached actually to my head. And you have to bring those, and you got to listen to program material, and then you got to measure, you got to listen, you got to measure, you got to listen until you get to the thing that's right. To me, the closest equivalent is cooking. You can follow a recipe to a T. You can like to the 1/8 of a teaspoon of that special spice. And then you go like this and you go, nah, it need more salt, or it needed more pepper. You always need more pepper. And that's how it is. Why is it? Maybe the salt you're using, this is actually getting close to what happens, I think. The salt you're using was just a little less oomphy than whatever
the pink salt.
It wasn't salty enough.
It was the pink salt.
Pink salt, yeah, which is not from the Himalayas, the mountain of the Himalayas at all, anyway. Or maybe the pepper you're using was a little milder or stronger than the pepper they had. Whatever. There are some variances. So let's talk about this. So you got to have a good speaker. You may if you're not doing my work, 90% of it is integration work, which is it's all on plan. The speakers go on the wall, in the wall, behind stretch fabric. You can't move them. They are where they're going to be because we're interacting with architects and interior designers. And yet with all that, we can get really good sound. But if you actually are an enthusiast, like the people on this this podcast,
go with it.
You can move speakers around. You may as well do that. Second thing. Third thing, you got to equalize them. Now, I'm sorry, wrong order. Third thing is do a little bit of acoustical treatment to your room. And what I mean by a little bit is you got to have the right judicious amount. It's like salt. If a little bit is good, why don't you just pour the whole can in there? Yeah. So I usually find that treating any more than 15 or 20% of the wall or ceiling surfaces with absorption over-absorbs the room, and it don't sound so good anymore. So you gotta You got to use acoustical materials judiciously, absorption and diffusion. You got to know where to put them. I don't know that we have the time today to go into that, but I'm just
I definitely said I want you back because I know that a lot of the folks are going to want to hear more detail, right? And there's just not enough time. So even before this whole thing, I invited you to be on another time. So there's more time.
I'll throw in a nod to that too, Anthony. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on absorption, like in a separate follow-on video, because I have some thoughts on that as well, but I'd really like your input on that. So
I want to know what staggered, the different. I want to know.
Well, like some speakers that maybe have like a rising treble could benefit more from absorption in the room than a speaker that maybe doesn't. And it comes down to preference or directivity. How wide a speaker is versus how narrow, and how those factors play in. That's something I'd like to discuss at a later point.
We can certainly talk about that.
Yeah.
I will say that in the olden days, speakers with really bad off-axis response were fixed by treating the room a lot. So a lot of older studios used speakers that were just crazy loud, but their off-axis was horrible. Mm-hmm. And by putting a ton of absorption in the room, you didn't hear the off-axis. You were basically anechoic. It was like giant headphones. That's not good sound. If anybody's ever walked into a recording studio like that and gone, okay, play it for me, it's got to sound great. And you're like, God, that sounds horrible. It's not your ears that are broken. It's just that it don't sound so good. I'm going to show one quick slideshow here that shows.
And while you're bringing that up, so I'll bring it up when I see it on the screen. But it's interesting because I contacted you because you purchased the toolkit, the spatial audio calibration toolkit, and then so I called you, and the first thing you said is congratulations on the stuff you're doing with the with the app, and so. The folks already know here I'm working on an app called Magic Beans and working on target curves. And so I thought that was surprising. I wouldn't have expected you to know about that, actually.
Well, I'll show you why in a second, because this stuff all matters. So number one, get a good speaker. Number two, try to move it around to where especially the bass response doesn't suck. Number three, put treatments in the room. And this is a very quick, we can talk more about this later, but this is a quick top view of a room treated. And this is me sitting here with my receding hairline. And this is an absorber on the right wall, another one. And these absorbers would maybe be, 4 feet tall by 2 feet wide, 60 by 120 centimeters, which seems like a lot, but actually, if you look at the total surface area of the room, it's 15% of it. Same thing on the other side. I prefer them staggered for a reason that we don't have time to get into. And then this represents a diffuser that's going to re-radiate into the room in a hemi-disc form. So like in a planar form. And these are diffusers that are going to re-radiate in a hemispherical form. And if you're serious about your sound and you have a dedicated or semi-dedicated room, or if you can put these things on the wall and cover them with stretch fabric so that they don't look ugly, you can end up with this. So the idea of the treatment, if it's done correctly, and I'm not saying you always have to do all of this, but if you can do this, the direct sound of your speaker is going to hit your head, and the off-axis sounds are either going to get absorbed or scattered back in the room, absorbed or scattered, and each one of these arrows is sort of pointing to an area, an area over here where that would be absorption or scattering. These are diffusers on the ceiling, and normally I also put absorbers in the front half of the ceiling, but I couldn't show them here. It would mess up with the animation. But the idea is you still want reflections from the room. You need a sauce. The room needs to fill in somewhat so that in the end you get the sense that you get a direct sound and you get reflections that are filling in all the way around. Otherwise the room doesn't sound good. It sounds unnatural. And I could give you lots of examples in cuisine, but nothing is better than something where you have some food and some sauce and the salt and the pepper all tight together, and it's all making me hungry. Maybe I'll have to eat some chocolate. So that's the next thing sort of in my recommendations is to do that. Now let me show you a room. That's this room in which turn that off. This is actually the response of this is a chart of the impulse response after some initial equalization. And this is showing, again, the sound at various frequencies that are hitting the microphone. Is this going to sound like complete dog do?
Maybe.
So here's what's interesting. The difference between this dip here that's at 76 and that peak is at 90, the very high resolution measurement over here shows 15 decibels of error, which is insanely bad. Yet you listen to this and it sounds like music. Like what? Well, your auditory system doesn't listen to all these little peaks and dips. We don't have that tight of a resolution. And your auditory system is not a little microphone sitting there pointing up at the sky. It's a pair of ears, two of them. If I actually took two measurements and averaged them together, I'll show you that later, that would smooth out. Plus your head's always moving. You're always averaging this thing out without realizing it. You're always moving around. Mm-hmm. So while this is what a single microphone can measure,
I can't see on here. What is the smoothing on here?
The smoothing
1/12. Okay.
On here is
1/12.
So 1/12. Of course, I could change the smoothing.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious how that would look with psychoacoustics smoothing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I have three screens. I click on that. It's showing up on the screen over here. Screen, yeah. Hold on one second. Let's change that over here. Let me close this. Let me go to controls. And
there it is.
Here, psychoacoustic smoothing.
So I think that's what you're saying is like it's
what
more,
you hear.
Yeah.
So I am going to mention this real quick. I have tried several of the auto EQ systems out there because I don't really relish the time of measuring and doing virtual bands up and down. That's no fun. The first 10 times you do it, it's exciting. The next 20 times you're like, okay. The next 500 times I'm like, if I have to do this again, I think I'm going to slit my wrists. I'm only slightly exaggerating, but this is no fun. Yet I see a lot of systems out there that start from the wrong premise of what you hear, and therefore they correct the wrong things. In the end, they sound terrible. We'll get more to that later. Now, what I want to show you here is the interpreted reflection decay time of this particular room. So this is a client who spent a lot of money on some pretty nice speakers and a pretty expensive surround processor and expensive amplifiers. And this is a measurement of the reflection decay time in the room. What does all this mean? You guys familiar with this, right? With this chart. Yes. So this is a display. I'll put it 20 to 20 kilohertz. This is a display starting at 20 hertz, going through 100 hertz, up to 1 kilohertz, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 kilohertz, and Room EQ Wizard basically stops there. You can go further in other programs, but whatever. And this is actually doing an interpretation of this really sophisticated measurement, showing you how long it takes for the sound to die out at these various frequencies. And in this particular room, where the clients really has aspirations for kick-ass sound, pardon my Portuguese, it shows that the reflection decay time is 1.2 seconds in the mid-range. So every sound that you put in the room in the mid-frequency is hanging out for over a second. Okay. It also shows that the sounds at 200 hertz die out after 600 milliseconds, half the time. It also shows that the sounds at high frequency die out, I'll go all the way to 10 kilohertz. They die out at 500 milliseconds, less than half the time. So you put a sound in this room out of perfectly good speakers, and this room has no acoustical treatments because it's just not in the cards. There are some relationship issues. And it's a mixed, what I call a mixed environment. It's a living room. There's a kitchen. There's open to everything. And, you can clap your hands and it goes, and the sound is going to hang out for 1.2 seconds in the mid frequency. And at low frequency, it's going to die out quickly. At a high frequency, it's going to die out quickly. Guess what that perfectly good pair of speakers sounds like? Hello. It sounds like there's no highs and no lows.
It's all mids.
The joke in the industry.
That little cough.
I don't get it.
Never heard that in my life.
Never heard that. So that's exactly what it sounds like. So you start with a perfectly good speaker in which the frequency response, let me go back over to that. The unequalized frequency response looked like this. But what you're hearing is something that sounds like this. So now what do you do to this? Well, you treat it. You got to do something to reduce this giant error in the reverb time. So what you would want to do is not treat the highs. You actually would want to put some kind of absorbers that have a lot of effectiveness between 300 and 400 hertz, which would be a 2-inch thick panel, and then basically stop being so effective about 5 kilohertz. There's a bunch of people who make those. They're thick panels that have a wood surface in the front with interesting decor. The Sonatus company that I have makes those too. They're called decozorbers, but there's other companies. I'll always give credit when the competition makes things that are just every bit as good. Pick ours, pick theirs, do something. I'm not done yet. Note that that the reflection decay time dies down here and then goes back up. What is up here? Well, at lower frequencies, the low frequency waves are actually becoming resonant within the cavity, and they're hanging out a lot. So what this room sounds like is it's got tremendous bass, no mid bass, this kind of shouty mid range, and no highs. And now what do? Well, client says we're not putting acoustical treatments on here. And you try to like reason with them. Okay, fine. Now what? Well, you look at this and you go, okay, I'm going to put a very broad attenuation here over this entire range. And I'm going to turn down this mid-range centered around 1.5 kilohertz, 1.2, 1.26. ISO third octave slots. You're just going to like crank it down and use these things. Listen to program material and go, I'm going to try to adjust this until it doesn't sound so bad. And in the end, if you do your job correctly, without changing the reflection decay time of the room, you can end up with this. So you'll notice this is sort of scalloped down here. You'll notice this is raised up. This is what it took for this room to produce sound out of the left speaker that sounded like decent music. The normal target curves you would see, and actually, Joe, you'll see this, would normally suggest that this should go falling off more. And in fact, I had to like turn it back up so that it's almost a flat line so that the highs sounded correct. So what you're not seeing really is that ultimately I stepped on this mid-range energy about 2 octaves wide, centered on 1.2 kilohertz until it started to sound good, and then got rid of little errors in the other curve here. You know, this error, this peak over here I had to pull out. That was just bad speaker design. But in the end, to be honest with you, because up until now I was lying. No, to be honest with you, in the end, while I sat and listened, I go, yeah, that sounds okay. It's all right. You know, I'm listening to program material. I'm used to listening to a lot. I'm like referencing it. The client was like, oh my God, you've got it. It sounds amazing. I can't wait to get my friends over here. This is, thank you. If I was any cuter, he probably had been kissing me.
Whoa, I like that. All right.
And maybe of a different gender.
Hey,
I do live in San Francisco. We're pretty open. We do whatever.
It's all right.
Do you?
So you can do it. So you can start with this. So the funny thing is you can start with a speaker that doesn't have a very good frequency response. And in this case, I actually had the facility to move the left and right speakers around, not the center, not the surrounds. I actually could move them around to smooth out the bass a little bit. And put no acoustical treatments, and just by judicious use of equalization and ears and measurement and equalization and ears and measurement, you can get to a point it's like, yeah, this is enjoyable. The imaging was good. You know, he was like really happy with how clear in stereo in 2-channel stereo, how clear he could hear the instruments in the middle. And if there was a guitar over here, he could hear it. If there was, some cymbal crashes over here, he could hear it. And I know that this room would sound a ton better if we could treat it, put something on the ceiling, put some drapes, do something, but you could get there. Now, I'm not done. I also know from having tried it that the auto EQ that was built into this particular piece of electronics, which I'm not going to mention, I don't want to be knocking anybody, didn't get even close to this. It produced sound that, for one, sounded different on every speaker. And I'll mention what I mean by that in a second. And never produced that thing that's like, yeah, it sounds like music. So sounds the same in all the speakers. Thank goodness, through the work of Technodad and Joe and Tell, there is now a test disc you can put on and you can listen to pink noise at the various channels in the room. That's like really quick. You do all this EQ and it should sound like the right sound, but also when you go from channel to channel, it should sound reasonably similar. And most of the auto EQ systems I know out there from all of the brands and all the different products, that simple test fails.
Wow.
Yeah. And now pink noise is a very sensitive. So I haven't explained because it's a test signal that basically covers from the lowest frequency you can hear to the highest frequency. It does fall off at 3 dB per octave, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's a noise sound that sounds like static. Shh. And you put it to every speaker after you've equalized it. It should sound more or less the same. And most of the auto EQ schemes I've seen don't. So there's reasons why they don't, starting with this don't listen like the ear does.
Right.
And if you use, this is ultimately a plea for doing it the right way, which is to use a manual EQ. Many of the products that have auto EQ also give you diddles that you can do. You can go to, I'll mention it, you can go to Dirac and tell it, okay, well, you did your thing. Now I'm going to change the target curve because I'm noticing that the left sounds brighter than the right. And so I'm going to tell you that the left needs to have a different target curve than the right. So you redo your calculation until you get it right. And I've done that.
Interesting. So you like to do different EQs per speaker.
I like every speaker to end up sounding like the same sound, which is
the same tonality.
Same tonality, and you can use pink noise, or you either listen to pink noise, or you listen to Diana Krall, or you listen to whoever you want to listen to. Actually, the excuse me was not about Diana Krall; it was my throat going.
Oh, okay.
Diana Krall is interesting in that a lot of her recordings are kind of bright, and if things are a little too sharp on the top end, you're like. But whatever you like to listen to, if you can actually play it around the room, one speaker at a time, it should sound exactly the same, or else you're not going to get immersive audio. It won't.
That's right.
The only way it's going to work is that they're all equally contributing. Right. So pink noise
what we
is
do
really
in car audio too.
Yep.
Like I learned that in car audio because you're asymmetric seating, right? Like you're not centrally located. So you've got to balance the gain, and it's not just levels; it's equalization as well. I mean,
in car audio, you got to balance three things: gain, delay.
Yeah.
And EQ. That closer driver to you needs to be delayed so the other one has time to arrive at you, so you end up with an image in the middle. Of course, the person sitting on the other seat is like
is the problem.
You forget it. Yeah,
they're the problem.
It's interesting though, because most of these automatic calibrations, they usually kind of like put speaker pairs together. So for Dirac, it would put left and right together, and it EQ them as a pair, and same with the surrounds and rear surrounds. That's just kind of how it does it. And I think Odyssey does the same thing too. It groups things together. So it's interesting that you do it separately. That's what I like to do also. Yeah. And I think some people are like, are you sure that's what we want to do? I'm like, I got you.
I'm not going to find it quickly, but I just finished a really high-end, super, super precise room, a post-production facility in which it was using 3 of our speakers, the Grimani system speakers in the front. And I tuned them to be, with the analyzer, a complete overlay first, then listen to them, go, okay, well, we need to balance that, retune them to where they overlaid, and the left and right didn't sound the same. Why? Because the character of the reflections in the left side of this room and the right side of the room were different enough that they sounded different. Sure. And so then you grab the bands of EQ until you hear pink noise going, shh, 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 and you listen to them. And then you listen to the phantom image between the two. And as you get them to sound the same, the phantom image gets more and more precise to where it's like razor sharp.
I like one of the things that you do where you have an IEM that the response of. Like, I thought that was a super cool trick. Yeah. Right? So you have these IEMs, and then you're listening to the pink noise through there. So you know what the source material is. And then you play the sound from the speakers, and you can kind of say, like, is this sound about right? So
it's the same thing we do in car audio too.
Cool. Oh, so you do that?
That's these little guys, Edemotic ER4S, very expensive. You plug them. You basically are jamming pink noise right down into your ear. Now, interestingly enough, it's the unit in here does not feed actual pink noise. It feeds a head-related transfer function correction for it sounding like pink noise coming from your ear, bouncing off there, going out to the opinion of your outer ear and down your ear canal. But there's an average compensation response for that so that it sounds right. So I listen to pink noise in the speakers, listen to pink noise and get them to sound right. So it's sort of subjective objective. It's subjective in that, by the way, the term subjective in science means it's perceived. It doesn't mean that you got a bias, right? Okay. The term subjective in plain English means, well, you got your own opinions about this. Mm-hmm. in wine tasting and listening test, visual test, subjective mean this is what you perceived, as opposed to objective, which is what a piece of machinery has measured.
And I think that's super interesting. That's why I wanted to talk about acoustics versus psychoacoustics, right? Because psychoacoustics means how we humans,
how we perceive, right?
And I think a lot of people get confused because they're like, well, all that matters is just listening, right? The only thing that matters. I'm like, yeah, but they're connected, right? You can correlate the two. They're not completely disconnected, and so that's what I would love for people to start to understand is, there's a connection between what you can measure, how you hear. We have an understanding of this stuff. Right. It's not this. A lot of the stuff is not brand new. Right. There's a lot of research that's been done about this.
The earliest reference I have to some of this is from 1952. So it's not brand new. I've got an old book on acoustics that my dad gave me by Harry Olson that talks about this. So I'm noticing that it's an hour into it.
Yeah.
Are we like cut off? Can we talk for another 5 minutes?
I mean, as long as they don't kick me out of this dealership, we're good to go.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to Techno Dad and having paid more. Well, why don't you buy something else?
Yeah, dude.
Exactly. Buy a new strut.
Let me get a new car real quick.
Hey, go get
the Porsche. Get the Porsche. Just get the Porsche while we're talking.
No, go buy you Twix from the vending machine and reenact the whole Seinfeld episode where George bought a Twix.
Well, they've got free snacks here for the guests. Anyway,
the mechanics.
I gotta ask the boss if it's okay. Oh, I forgot.
We're the boss.
So let me share this screen here. Let's see.
Here we go.
All right, let's talk about this. So I started off with buy an R8. Yeah, go buy an R8. You got to have a good speaker. You gotta place it correctly. You got to have some acoustical treatment, and then you got to tune the EQ. I just want to give you a little bit more of a visceral expression of that. So, I'll go to this thing here. This is what happens in a room. I've showed you this a little bit, but I just want to run it by you. Center speakers playing sound. There's a blue line going from it to your head, and then there are sounds bouncing off the room. I think I brought the wrong.
It's a maze. It's like one of those laser things that they're trying to get through in the movies, right?
Right. Yeah. So what's interesting, people don't realize, is that there's one blue vector, one tunnel of sound from the speaker to your head, and then there's a sound that just goes slightly off axis for the speaker and just misses your head. And at low frequency, the waves are big, so it's going to hit your head. But at the mids and highs, it starts to get smaller and smaller. And it is like a wave that's passing you. You're not even hearing it. And it bounces over there around the room. And then there's an off-axis energy at 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. And if you just look at those bounces in 10 degrees, this is just 10-degree increments. There's all these red arrows of the reflections off the room. Now, big news. There's in a typical room with no treatments. So take a room that's 25 feet long, 18 foot wide, 10 foot ceiling. There's about 3 or 4 times more energy coming back from these red arrows than the blue arrow. 3 or 4 times. So what goes into your ear canal is 3 or 4 times more sound that's bounced around the room than the clean sound coming from the speaker to you. Reflections dominate. Now, you treat the room, and as long as you don't over-treat it, you're going to bring that ratio down. But even when you treat it, covering only 15 or 20% of the wall surfaces, you're still going to be dominated by reflections, about 2 to 1. Okay, so even in a treated room, there's 2 times more sound energy coming from all the reflected field than the direct field of the speaker. Is that a good enough reason to worry about what happens in the reflected field of a room? I think so. So the quality. So
this is a reverberant field.
This is what's called a reverberant field. Hold on, let me close my window over here because it's getting.
You got the whole
a reflection over here. All right, can you hear me? Can you see me now? So, ultimately, this is another plea for following the work of Dr. Floyd Toole and other people who have been working on this a lot, which is ultimately. The quality of the reflected sounds are really what matters. When you're sitting and listening to a speaker and go, oh, it sounds good. Okay. that means that the direct sound of the speaker is good, and the reflected sounds through the room are okay.
I see. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's important. Really important.
And that's measurable.
And that's measurable because you can look at what's called the sound power of a speaker. And you can look at the off-axis response. You can look at the people who measure them. You can look at manufacturers that provide that, and you can go, here's a speaker that has a good axial response, a good direct sound, but then also all the reflected sounds are also pretty good, and that's going to sound good in a room.
And EQable.
It's EQable. So now what is the room going to do this? It's still going to change it a little bit, but mainly in the low frequency. So in the case of the work I've done, in the speaker company, we developed a special waveguide, which his role is to put the tweeter into it and basically force it out to be the same dispersion at all frequencies. So whether you're listening right here, or if you're looking at a reflection that's bouncing off here, it's the same response. If it's bouncing here, it's the same response. It's quieter, but it's the actual same axial response and same phase response. Really important. And that's sound power. That's what we call, that's what's known as the sound power in speaker design. That's a good way to design a speaker. We're not the only people doing that. We take this to kind of another level with some new patents and stuff, but there's plenty of speakers out there that have good sound power. And they usually sound better to most people. The listening tests that the Harman crew and other people have done have revealed that, more people like the sound of those speakers. So that's an example of a speaker we make that looks like this, industrial piece of gear with two good woofers and a tweeter inside this waveguide, which his job is not to do this to it, but actually spread it out.
So that's not a horn.
It's not a horn. It's a waveguide.
That's a waveguide.
It looks like a horn, but its job is not to amplify the sound in this direction. Instead, the tweeters, in the case of this speaker, the tweeters at the top, and just like an irrigation nozzle, which his job is to spray out spray out the water evenly so all of your plants are well irrigated. And I know this because I spent most of yesterday, Mother's Day, fixing the irrigation at home. And now my back really hurts. It's the same thing. Its job is to spray a really even dispersion in the room. Okay. I'll flip through these slides. This is actually how it's done. The tweeter is not in the throat this way. It's actually transversal.
Almost like a speaker tongue right there.
But the main idea is to distribute the sound horizontally at all frequencies. Now, a lot of manufacturers say they have wide dispersion, but they don't always tell you at what frequency, and you really want to look at the response charts to look at what is the off-axis response. So
there you go, Aaron. I know you like wide dispersion.
Yeah. I like wide dispersion generally.
That's it.
So the funny thing is, all speakers are wide dispersion at some frequency, right? Mm-hmm. So even a speaker with a horn, like this on the front of a speaker, front of a tweeter that crosses over at 1 kilohertz, at 500 hertz, it's wide dispersion. So it goes from wide dispersion to suddenly narrow dispersion. So what does that do? If you took a speaker like that, and I went back to my diagram, actually, let's just say that you had that. So that this arrow here on a speaker like that was down 8 dB compared to that. Now what's bouncing off the wall is, instead of being nice and smooth, looks like this. And now what you're hearing in the room is it's a little dull. So now you have to equalize it, but you're going to equalize it up, and the direct sound is going to have a rise in response, and the reflected sound plus all that is going to be flat. And now on some program material, it sounds like this, and on other program material, it sounds good, and you start to chase your tail. And no auto EQ system I know knows how to untangle this correctly.
Yeah, I've seen speakers where they have really awesome directivity, and even if the frequency response isn't the best, I'm like, I could work with that.
Correct. And I'm about to show one. So ultimately, the Holy Grail is a speaker that has a really even dispersion. Actually, what matters more than being wide is to have constant dispersion, so that as you go off axis, as it's fallen off, it doesn't fall off like this or like this or like this. It's just a really smooth change. And then you can equalize that. You can make
I think, Aaron, you've interviewed Earl Getty, right?
Right.
Yep.
Earl Getty's went so far as to say that if you have speakers with constant directivity, you don't need EQ. I disagree, because the room is going to have its own sound power that's also going to affect it. So if you have a room with incredibly well-treated response and speakers with constant directivity and some higher directivity, maybe you can get to the point where you don't need EQ. And at that point, It's all great. But then I also find that every speaker is still going to sound a little different. Anyway, so this is how the directivity is measured is a spinorama. There's 70 points measured either in an anechoic chamber or a simulated near field anechoic if you're lucky enough to have a Klippel system in your living room.
Aaron.
Yeah.
It's actually the dining room, right, Aaron?
Oh, the dining room.
Yeah,
So you guys
dining
don't
room,
eat,
yeah.
you just eat out or something.
I just eat on the couch and listen to my sound bar.
There you go. There you go.
There it is.
So here's the spinorama response of one of our speakers, the Alpha. Please don't take this as an ad for just our speaker. Take this as an education of charts you should be looking at. And you're going to start to see this more and more from manufacturers, certainly from Aaron and other people that voluntarily go measure these things and publish them. You're going to see that. And what you see here is the black and the green here are the direct response from the speaker to your ear and the listening window, which is an average of this kind of oval window of the sound going towards the listeners in the room. In the case of the speaker, they're a complete overlay of each other. The speaker has really smooth listening window. In yellow is an interesting thing called the early reflections, which is the sound that goes over to the walls, the ceiling, and floor. So it starts at, the listening window is 0, 15, 30 degrees, and 15 degree. It's actually usually measured with a higher resolution, but it's an average of that. 0, 15, 30 in one direction, 15, 30 in the other direction, and plus and minus 20 vertically as this listening oval. And then the early reflection is the stuff that would hit the wall. So after 30, you get 45. So 45, et cetera, out to 75. I don't think it includes 90 in the latest specs, but this is basically what's going to the walls. And that particular speaker has a response that goes to the walls that it's quite similar. It is attenuated here. This is an older version. The newer ones are actually smoother. But it's a very similar curve compared to the axial response. So what's hitting the room is very similar to what's going direct. And then in blue is what's called the sound power, which is the net spherical average of all the energy going in all directions, forward, top, bottom, left, right, back, everywhere, with a weighting. It's not straight equivalent arithmetically, but there's a weighting. Anyway, and you'll see on that speaker that it's very similar to the axial response. There's a little 3 dB bobble over here that comes from the crossover directivity between the mids and the tweeter. Newer versions that we've added away on that, so that's smoother. You can also see down here in these spinorama curves the early reflection directivity index and the net directivity index that shows that this speaker has a directivity index of about 5 dB broadband. Here's another speaker we make called the Tau. This is a two-way floor standing self-powered speakers. All the speakers we make, by the way, are active. And by using active crossover, you can fix a lot of issues in the directivity. This is the off-axis response of a Rixos S non-average, where you're looking at the progression. This is our smallest speaker. You're looking at the progression horizontally. As you see, as you go off-axis, it doesn't suddenly like nosedive. It just attenuates. This is somebody else's speaker. Not
Brand X.
Brand X, not totally smooth, but not terrible. This over here is the sound power, the average.
You need to zoom in on that y-axis a little bit too.
Yeah. This is somebody else's speaker, unnamed, another brand. It was the XY. This is a speaker in which, when you look at the frequency response, it's kind of funky. But
I think
when
it's
you
the
look
R200.
It is.
I'm not. Oops.
You've given it a
It's all right. It's all right. We've measured that speaker. Aaron's measured that speaker. I've measured that speaker. We know what it does.
Let's see. I was going to try to cheat this. Anyway,
It's all good. It is what it is. Just the measurement.
So what's interesting with the speaker is this character, this directivity index, which is up and down and up and down. So it goes quite directional at the high frequency, which you can see in the sound power. How are you going to correct this? What this speaker is going to sound like in the room is sort of a little bit the inverse of this response, which is it's going to sound a little dull on the top end. It's going to have a peak and dip because what you're listening to is the sound power. There's people who are going to say, well, but I can hear the speakers over there. There's 3 times more energy coming from everywhere else. You're lying to me. I can hear the speakers over there. You guys know why you can hear where the speaker's coming from?
Haas effect.
Who's that Haas guy?
We talking about precedence effect? Not presidents.
Precedence effect coined by Mr. Haas many years ago. It says that your ear brain system, your humanoid animals do that
I
too.
feel like this is a test. I'm doing pretty good.
You're doing good. Actually, by doing that, it gives me time to drink some water and maybe have some chocolate. I don't know.
Chocolate again, huh?
Chocolate.
No chocolate.
Remember, chocolate tells you what the nutrition facts are, but speakers don't. We got to change that. So
you don't want to EQ the places where there's a lot of change happening.
So what do you do with this? You put the speaker in a room, and it's going to sort of sound like the inverse of this curve. So you're going to pull. This is going to be attenuated. You're going to push up 2.5 kilohertz, so that on kind of steady state music, things like orchestral, it doesn't sound like it's missing something. On voices, it doesn't sound like the voices are too far away. And then you listen to strident sound effects or percussions, and now you've pushed up that 2.5 kilohertz, and it's like, oh yeah. It's really hard to fix a speaker like this.
Well, so here's the thing with this particular speaker that that one, if I recall correctly, a lot of the irregularity and the directivity is due to the vertical placement of the tweeter and the mid-range, right?
Yeah.
So this is the area where I will take the data and provide a standalone linearity plot, but then I'll also plot the horizontal only directivity index. So you can kind of separate that out, because when I was talking to Dr. Toole about that, I think he was saying that the verdict was still out on, the floor and ceiling bounce, like how much that actually matters. And that they had actually done some testing where they had simulated removing the floor and people didn't like it.
Yeah.
Which I found very interesting. So that's one kind of caveat I throw out when I see these things. And I'm like, some of that could be due to the vertical. And I don't know, personally, I don't know how much I need to worry about that or not.
Right. You're right. The vertical, the way the vertical is interpreted by our auditory system is really different. Check this out. Because your two ears are bolted on your head this way, you have a pretty good discrimination between the first arriving sound and therefore the Haas effect, precedence effect, and the reflections this way, because you can tell the difference in sound between here and there. The correlation between the two ears is shadowed by your head. There's a different arrival time. And so the reflections that are horizontal have a low interaural cross correlation. That's the term. Reflection off the ceiling hits your two ears identically. And so then it's harder to separate it from the direct sound, because you don't have all the same cues. It's arriving later, but you don't have all of the same information, the psychoacoustic information to go, well, that's obviously a reflection. So depending on the kind of speaker and how far the ceiling and how far the floor is, all these different things, it can affect it tremendously or not at all. And so it gets complicated. And a lot of work has been done in these anechoic spaces where you have all these little speakers everywhere where you can simulate those reflections. Anyway, let me show you another speaker. This is some other speaker, whatever. Well, let's keep going. So let's go to this speaker that I had earlier, which is predicted to have this in-room response. So the prediction is you put the speaker in a room with or without treatments, and it's going to sound like this. It's going to have a mid-range dip, which could sound good on music, as in it makes the strings sound soft. It makes horns sound nice and smooth, all good. But on movies, it means that, for one, dialogue is going to sound very, very soft because you're missing that 2.5 kilohertz clarity. Sound effects are going to sound recessed. It's basically wrong.
Sounds like an LS35A right there.
Maybe.
The BBC dip, right?
But take a look at the directivity of the speaker. So while all of these curves look pretty, like, not pretty, if you actually look at the directivity index, the sound power directivity index, which is this curve compared to the listening window, which is the red curve. If you just do a mathematical division of those two, you'll end up with this. And this is a speaker that, other than this rise over here, has a pretty smooth off axis, or has an off.
Aaron, you got to take off. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Anthony. I got to cut out. I was trying to make it quiet in the background, but it was great to actually get to talk to you, and I hope I get to jump in with you guys sooner.
Sounds great.
Later. All right, take care.
Thanks.
Later.
So here's a speaker that needs equalization. Okay, these are anechoic responses. You put it in a room, and the low frequency response is going to go up and down. Like, don't tell me a room's not going to affect the speaker. Don't tell me you can put so much acoustical treatment that you're going to like have that be linear. That's a lie. Anybody who says you that has also got a bridge they want to sell you, and you should just.
And some magic beans too, right?
Yeah. So There's somewhere below 200 or 300 hertz, the room's going to start to take over and introduce peaks and dips in this. And I don't know how to do annotations on this live stream. There's got to be a way to do it, but whatever, doesn't really matter. And so you need an EQ. That's how it is. So you're going to put some acoustical treatments to reduce the amount of reflected energy. You're still going to maintain this sound power as long as the acoustical treatment system is correct. You're still going to be listening to this. So you got to EQ this out. And so you're going to smooth this out. There's going to be some errors at low frequency. You're going to smooth this out. And this is a speaker that I believe could, like you said, Joe, could be made to sound okay, even though it started off as something that's not very smooth response. The other one, you couldn't. You would end up chasing your tail. So just to kind of finish up on this, if you knew what the speaker was and you knew what its directivity was, you could actually come up with a target curve that goes, this is what we should end up with. And that's the whole point. And
because I've talked a lot about how a lot of people use a prescribed target curve. I should use the Harman target curve. Well, I've talked to Dr. Floyd Toole and he said that's not meant to be used in that way. And we've talked on the phone and I said, if you're to guess, it's a better guess than flat, right?
Yeah.
It's a better guess, but it's still not correct for every single situation. Even if you're to use the JBL M2 that they used, still not every single situation because it's an average. And so, I've looked into, you said that you have some patents on this and you do, it's SBIC is what I saw, sliding band integration curve. And just to let you know, my method when I'm doing my with my app is not the same. So just to let you know,
well, the
measurements are taking measurements is part of it, but everybody takes measurements. But your method is a little bit different. It's interesting, but I have a different approach. Yeah.
Well, the SBIC is a measurement method in which you're starting with I know nothing. And the measurement method there is let's measure the near field. And I don't mean by that a microphone far away with a short window. I'm saying bring the mic within 2 or 3 feet of the speaker and figure out what it's putting into the room. Then
I'm with you.
Plant 4 microphones, 4, 5, 6 microphones in different places in the back of the room. I use 4 microphones with what's called a multiplexer, which is a thing that switches from one to the other and you average out. And look at what that's doing, which is the far field in the room, the actual long term. And stare at both of those and integrate those two together with a crossover slope, which is all part of the patent. And you'll end up with something that when you listen to it, you go, yeah, that sounds like pink noise on my Edimotics, and that sounds like Diana Krall if we keep using her. More often than not. It's not perfect either because it's still microphones, which I'm going to keep doing that. They don't listen like the ear and the brain, but it gets you a little closer. Yeah. And some of the analysis tools out there try to do that. They try to measure a shorter time window, thereby rejecting more of the room. And some of them do it pretty good. Some of them don't. Many years ago, there was a system out there that people were using quite a bit that had not a sliding window, but a different approach at looking at the different time windows. It's a thing you got to do. You got to understand what it is. Now, if you can generate an application in which you take data in which the frequency response and the actual sound power character of that, for one, and then for two, you infuse that with knowing something about the reverb in the room, for two, you can come up with a target curve that you tell people, look, you should be looking for this response because that's going to make it work right. That's
exactly what our goal is with the app. And I think that, we have definitely different approaches to that, but I think the same idea that, every room is different. The type of speaker matters, right, and that it also matters the type of measurements that you're taking.
Right.
So you don't take the right measurements. You just don't have enough information. Right. And so I can look at a lot of these room corrections and say you just don't have enough information to make a good correction. They can make a guess, could be correct, but you can make a better guess if you take better measurements.
Right. That's where you have to bring your ears. So what's interesting in what you're trying to do is if I can go back to showing the screen. Let's see, stop screen setting. So I'm going back to the Alpha speaker, older product, whatever. Note that the sound power is very flat all the way up. It doesn't fall off like most speakers do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This speaker here has a sound power or a directivity that you can see the directivity going up, which means the sound power is falling off, which is pretty typical as the tweeters start naturally to beam. They actually have a hotspot in front of them. If you want to hear that, play pink noise on a speaker, move around, and you'll hear the hotspots. So these speakers have this wide dispersion because they've got these waveguides. And then let me go back. Again, I'm not. This isn't propaganda for buy our speakers. They're the best speakers in the world. Well, you should. This is propaganda for the importance of having a wide and constant dispersion. And Harman has speakers that do that, and other people have speakers that do that. The guys at Paradigm, they obsess over that. There's a bunch of people who do that. And it doesn't necessarily cost a whole lot more, a little bit more, but it's the right way to go about it. What we have found from now 6 years of doing this is that the target curve, if you want to call it, on the top end doesn't have that, that Harman thing that it's fallen off. The typical Harman target is a bit of boost at the low frequency. It goes like that, gently rolls off, and somewhere around 6 or 7 kilohertz. It doesn't nosedive, but it falls off. If we do that, our speakers are going to sound dull because the sound power is flat and it's measured by the microphone. So it's almost a flat, the in-room response that sounds right. Ultimately, it's what sounds right. Right? Ultimately, if you stop with the measurements and listen to program material, and you go back and forth and you go, what does it take to sound right, is actually a flatter response, which is exactly what you're working on, which is tell me what the sound power of the speaker is. Hopefully tell me what the room is doing. I'm going to tell you a sort of a customized target curve for what you should be expecting for this to sound right.
Yeah, I've experienced that with a line array that I've worked on. So we know the properties of an array and how it changes based on distance and how that's different. And the target curve on that particular system was way flatter than you would expect for the top end because it's a different type of speaker, right?
Right.
And so if we put a different speaker there, then the target curve might be different. So I think we're on the same page when it comes to the fact that target curves depend on your room and the speaker and how the speaker interacts with the room. So yeah, I'm excited for the app. I'm excited for people to try it out. I'm excited for you to try it out.
Yeah,
to see what you think. I think it's a big deal because you spend all this money on your speakers, you buy this processor, all very expensive stuff, and then you run the calibration, but like most people do, and then it asks you, what target curve do you want? And usually it has a default one, and sometimes those are pretty bad. The default, and that's going to greatly affect
your
the sound that you're going to perceive. So it's like, I think it's important to know what the target curve should be.
Right.
And that's the part that's missing, I think, a lot of times for people. They're doing all this stuff and they just don't know what to put there. So they probably just hit next, whatever's there, they hit next, and that's it.
I did that, and then I'm thinking, because I'm like, well, should I boost something? Should I cut something? How about I just leave it alone and then just move on, right?
Yeah. Well, what I like to say about all that is that when I'm all done producing pretty pictures on my computer from a few hours of diddling EQ, what people call PEQ, parametric EQ bands, that's just the beginning. That's kind of going back to cooking. Once you put everything in the pot and you stir it up, that's just the beginning of cooking. It's like, what do you do? What do you do next that matters? Are you going to add a little bit? Are you going to do something else to make it just right?
You gotta taste it, then tweak it. Taste it, tweak it.
Make sure to join us every Monday for our live stream at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern at youtube.com/Daily HiFi.